This was something completely new for me. I don't profess to be any kind of miniature painting expert, and I'm certainly not an expert in creating structures for dioramas, but I really wanted to try something different, so here it is. It's an experiment, that's what it is. And here I must make a little excuse. I don't have very good eyesight. I think I need new glasses. I haven't had them changed in a couple of years. So, if you're feeling critical of my painting, yeah, I don't mind. I'll blame my eyes, but as I said, I'm no expert anyway. For me, this was just about experimenting and having some fun. So I hope you enjoy the video. Let's crack on with it. I bought this 3D printed hobbit hole facade from eBay about a year ago. I have no idea what its original home was, or what brand it is, what make it is, where it was created, etc. It was just purely a random purchase. And because I'd be sculpting the inside of the hobbit hole as well, I cut out the window panes. Oh, by the way, if you want to know why I've got slightly longer nails on one hand, it's because I play the guitar. But I don't play the soundtrack to my videos. I adapted these plastic windows to fit the interior window frames of my hobbit hole. I really didn't mind getting glue everywhere here because I knew the inside surface of this facade would be covered up anyway. The roof and walls were constructed using an empty toilet roll. There isn't much point in me explaining what's going on here. You'll be able to see it anyway. It's fairly straightforward. Here I'm just applying some super glue gel to the edges using a popsicle stick or a lolly stick or just a plain old mixing stick, and that's some super glue activator as well. Now for the inside of the door, I measured the diameter and then found a plastic tube lid to be the same size, so I just adapted that by cutting off the top of it and then removing the interior section. This would be my door frame, and I just tidied it up using an engraving tool. And then I just stuck this onto a disc of balsa wood that I'd cut out previously. and then glued that to the inside of the hobbit hole facade, matching the position of the door on the outside and ensuring that the grain of the wood was vertical. And then I started working on where the passageways would come in on the side of the main room. But before I finished those, I decided to work on the interior beams, matching the beams on the front of the hobbit hole. And these were made just with some balsa wood. And then I made the curved ceiling beams, again using a sheet of balsa wood. A little tidying up was required where I'd been overzealous with the glue. And then it was back to the passageways. Now it's a little hard to explain what I did here. Basically, I just went with my gut feeling on how to do it. I wanted to create a kind of open look with these passageways opening out into living spaces, so I wanted a kind of pillared look almost. My advice would be to just watch how I do it. Oh yeah, and don't worry, I'm not cutting into my finger here. There is plastic underneath this cardboard. There you go. And there you have it. Who would have thought you could do so much with a used toilet roll, huh? So now it was onto the floor, and I just measured the width of the floor I'd need on this balsa wood sheet and then cut it using my scalpel, which by now was losing a bit of its edge, but never mind, I persevered. Balsa wood is extremely easy to cut, of course, especially if you cut along the grain. Now heading back to the door, I realised that my inside door frame was too deep, so I needed to fill it with an extra piece of balsa wood. But before I did that, I scored in the plank lines along the grain, just using a pen at first, and then to make them a little deeper, just a pointed tool. And then I just fixed this in place. And here I'm just removing the edges of the roof and floor to match the base, which I don't fix on yet, which is why you won't see it. And initially I had decided to use milliput to fill in between the beams and build up the wall texture, but it proved a nightmare to get it anywhere near flat, so I gave up in the end and used plaster, as you'll see in a moment. But I did find the milliput was good for building up those pillared sections, as I called them previously. and for filling in gaps in the cardboard. And I used sculpting plaster from Warworld Scenics because it's got a slightly rougher texture than plaster of Paris, and I mixed it very thinly with water and then used a pipette to drop it in between the beams and around the door frame and allowed it to find its level. And as it's set up slightly, I could also brush it over the surface of the walls where there were no beams to contain it. And then I followed the same procedure on the front of the diorama. Here I'm just brushing some of the plaster away from the wood grain and stone textures. To make the planks for the floor, I used some more balsa wood. It's really easy to make these. All you do is cut them into strips of equal width and then cut them to your desired length, making some half as long as others so that you can stagger them. And these are just glued in place using standard PVA. For the base I used a small box picture frame and I filled it with a square of extruded polystyrene cut exactly to size, and then I used PVA to glue on my diorama at the required angle. An angle always makes things a little bit more interesting, and when I say angle I mean a diagonal. I used milliput to build up the landform of the garden, and then a square edge just to make sanding it later a little easier, and I also started to sculpt the fireplace using milliput. This would just be a stone fireplace, so I didn't need to be too neat here, but I did need to make sure that it wasn't a ghastly mess where it met the wall and the ceiling. And of course you can't have a fireplace without a chimney, and this one was sculpted entirely from milliput. And then I just neatened up the interior of the fireplace a little bit just to square it off, and then just made sure the outside edges of the diorama were still square, before applying the fire hearth, which was just made with balsa wood. To neaten up the sides of the diorama, I first shaved away the cured milliput using my scalpel. And then a cheap florist's knife. Not a cheap florist, the knife was cheap. And then sanded it using a sanding block and 400 grit sandpaper while wearing a good dust mask. You don't want to be breathing in these particles of epoxy putty. And after all of that, it was time to move on to the turf, and for that I used sculptor mould, applying a nice thick layer over the roof and being careful not to get it over the chimney, and to make sure it was fairly neat and uniform where it lipped over the front and back of the hobbit hole roof. And then I continued building up the landform in the garden, including a little bit of a hill or a bank at the side of the hobbit hole there, leaving a kind of shallower area where the path would go, and then using plaster to create the fine surface of the path. And then I used more sculptor mould to make the stony surface texture of the fireplace. And once that had dried, I made a wooden beam across the mantelpiece, if you like, of the fireplace using milliput, and scored in some lines to look like wood grain. And then I applied the door hinges. These were just made using balsa wood again. To prepare for the inner roof beams, I'll call them, the ones that sit above the interior decorative roof beams. I'm getting a bit confused as to what they should be called. I scraped away some of the sculptor mould and then drilled some holes. And then just filled these with small pieces of balsa wood. Didn't really matter if they were a bit wonky, it just adds to the character. So says I, who made this piece. Anyway, moving on to priming, I used some Hydro by Plasticoat. They were very generous and gave me a few cans of this a while back to use in my videos. And then I glazed the windows using some plastic from an old packet. And then set about the incredibly tedious and fiddly task of applying milliput window frames to the inside of the windows. As an earth undercoat, I used Vallejo's dark earth texture paint. And then I started work on the floor and other woodwork, first using contrast paint from Citadel. This is Gore Grunter Fir. But you know what, I'm not going to show all the steps I took in painting because it took a very long time. As I said, my eyesight's not brilliant at the moment and I can't remember all the steps. I certainly didn't film them all. I was just trying to get it to look okay and largely in line with my imagination. I wanted the walls of the front of the hobbit hole to look like cob, so I used some sepia wash here from Vallejo, and I also applied that to the inside walls. This is homemade black ink wash. And I think this is Corax White from Citadel. And when I said I didn't film all the painting, I meant it. You can see there's a massive change there. I've really dulled down the wood. I've forgotten how, I'm afraid. I think I used dry brushing. But this is some more contrast paint from Citadel. It's called Warp Lightning. And here's some more homemade black ink wash. And now, sticking with the garden, I applied some dried clay dust. I'm not sure you can get clay dust that isn't dry actually, over the path. Then I sprayed this with isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension and applied over some scenic glue. You can see it still pulled a bit on the surface, but I mopped that up with a paper towel. And when that was dry, I went over it again with some homemade black ink wash, rendering the previous coat of black ink wash completely pointless. Anyway, this is a grey wash I mixed up just by adding a little bit of white to the black ink wash. And then I used some weathering powders from WWS just to blend the path into the earth and to add a little bit of tonal variety to the path itself. And finally, just a bit more highlighting down the centre of the path. Right, so heading indoors again, I started to create the glow from the fireplace, or rather from the fire in the fireplace, using some yellow ochre acrylic paint, diluted slightly with water. And again, you'll see quite a significant leap in progress here that I didn't film, and that's because I just spent ages trying to get it right. And during that time, I just forgot to film. I was enjoying the process too much and also not enjoying not being able to see. I don't know, I was caught somewhere between the two. Anyway, after painting the roof with some flesh wash game ink from Vallejo, I moved on to making the table, and this was made using the base of a tree from Woodland Scenics, glued to a mini oil drum lid, and then I created some books. Now the book I'm creating here is a bit big, so actually I didn't use this one. I created some smaller ones, but it's just a piece of balsa wood glued in between a folded piece of paper. This paper actually had that kind of gummed finish like an envelope seal that you can lick or you can wet to stick it down, but that didn't work, so I used glue. And then at last it was on to static grass. Now this is a mix of 2, 4 and 6 millimeter grasses from Knock and Woodland Scenics among others, and I applied it using Knock's Grassmaster 3 Profi, which they were generous enough to gift me a while back for use in a previous video. And the glue I'm using here is Mod Podge Matte. Diorama Precipe, or Precipe, has generously supported me with products in the past, and I'm still getting through them. They are wonderful products. I'm not going to try and pronounce the names of them. I'll leave you to read that. I'll just embarrass myself. And this is some Woodland Scenics Fine Turf Burnt Grass, just to add a more of a mossy look to the grass. I didn't actually end up using all of these floral products from Diorama Precipe, but the ones I did use were marvellous. The ones I didn't use are marvellous, they just didn't suit this scene. And now the ultimate horrible project for someone with bad eyesight, making a hanging lamp using a fiddly plastic kit. I gave it a go. I'm not sure how well it turned out, but I'll give it another go when I get new glasses, see how that works. It might not end up any better, I might be making excuses, who knows. One thing's for sure, after handling it so much, trying to get the thing to stick to the roof, I had to touch up the paintwork once it had actually stuck in place. And now, because this was the scene where Bilbo is looking at the One Ring just before he's about to leave Bag End for good, I thought, well, of course he would have his travelling trunk there. So I put it there. And then I made the fire itself just using small pieces of twig, which I painted with brown and yellow and orange and white acrylic paints. I also painted my hands. And you can see I really spent some time defining the firelight glow on the floor. As I said, I didn't film that. But after all of that, it was time to place Mr. Bilbo Baggins himself in the scene, and of course Gandalf just arriving outside, ready to lay the law down if necessary. L-O-R-E, that is. And then all that was left to do was to paint the edges using black gesso. Actually not quite all, because I just painted a little bit of a shadow leading away from Bilbo. And there we go. My first attempt at a structure in a diorama. I'm fairly pleased with how it turned out. I would do it better if I could see properly and as my skills progress. I'm not pretending to be an expert at this kind of diorama build. But this was all about having fun and trying something different. And I really hope you enjoyed watching my attempt. If you want to support me and help me make more videos, then I have a Patreon page where I share monthly written tutorials featuring projects that I don't share on YouTube. Each one with many, many photos covering every aspect of the build. You can also get early access to these videos. Of course, another way you can support me is by hitting the subscribe button and liking this video. Perhaps I'll try more of this style of diorama. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. But for now, and until next time, thanks for watching and cheerio!